Welcome everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We are very fortunate to have Lochner Marais and also Etienne Nel joining us from South Africa. It's very early in the morning there, so we're very fortunate they are able to join us today. I would like to start by giving an acknowledgement of country, acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands, of all the lands on which we are meeting today. For me personally, that is the Yagara and Turrbal people. I respect the elders past, present, and emerging, and I extend that acknowledgement to all the lands on which we are meeting today. So it's a great pleasure to be introducing this webinar on gold mining, closure, and path dependence, so lessons from South Africa. Lochner and Etienne are great colleagues and we have collaborated on many things, and I always enjoy reading their work. So what I will do is, without further ado, is pass over to Lochner and to Etienne to take us through today's webinar. Just a note that if you have questions, please post them in the chat, and then what we'll do is we will refer those questions to the speakers at the end. So please post your questions in the chat, and over to you, Lochner and Etienne.
Right, thank you so much. So I'm Etienne Nel. I actually live in New Zealand, but I'm currently visiting in South Africa and working with Lochner, who's based in the center of South Africa in a city called Bloemfontein. And both of us have an interest in mining and mining towns, and particularly the boom and bust cycles. And this is partially a reflection on work we've both been undertaking over the last 25 years or so. And so, as you can see from my title, we're looking at a 70-year process of boom and bust, and what we argue we can learn from the rise and demise of an area which is defined as the Free State Goldfields. And now it's now known as the Machabeng municipality, but it will illustrate this shortly in a map-based form with this particular slide. So if you have a look at the map on the top right-hand side, that shows the outline of South Africa. The grey area in the middle is the Free State province, which Lochner is based in, but also was one of the wealthiest gold mining areas in the country. And then if you look at the main map, the purple area is this Machabeng area, centered on a city called Welkom, spatially roughly 50 kilometers, 40 kilometers across, north-south and west-east. And the picture at the bottom is just an illustration of what the place looks like. So if we switch to the notes now on the other side there, what we're going to examine today is the growth and decline of what was once one of the world's wealthiest gold fields. When it was proclaimed in the 1940s, it caused the largest run on the London Stock Exchange up to that date and time. Prior to the 1940s, it was really just semi-arid veld with a very low population on it, but it rapidly grew to a conurbation of 500,000 people, largely centered on the city of Welkom, but also surrounding smaller urban centers. And by the 1980s, we're talking of 180,000 miners working in the area. Welkom initially started as a private city before the state eventually took it over after nearly 30 years. It's an interesting story in terms of mine closure, because we're not talking about a mining town, we're talking about a mining city and a whole mining region linked to this. So the bust story is really tragic in terms of just the scale of how it plays out. Obviously, we acknowledge you can't divorce this whole story from South Africa's apartheid history and labor exploitation, which ensured profit-taking as well as racial exploitation. 1990s, the decline starts, and we see then a saga of demining, but also failure to effectively diversify. Now, this is just a satellite image showing the main focus of the area. You can in the center of this image is the city of Welkom, and you can see the tailings dams and mine dumps surrounding the city as a direct result of the presence of the 18 mines district. In terms of our own work, this is just some of our ongoing work, literally over 25 decline and response, trying to see the social impact of what was taking place and whether response measures could make a difference. I think just one of the first things is right back from the 1990s, the local folk knew closure was coming and they tried to put in place measures to respond to it. but unfortunately, it would be difficult to say that it's met with resounding success. So just in terms of our plan and our introduction, it's very much an inductive type of research, which we learned as we've gone along over 25 years. We can then some initial lessons, tell the story and look at implications at the end. And our plan, there's background, economic change, planning and housing, economic change and diversification, and risks. The two images there, one of the very large gold mines, most of these have now closed. And the bottom image is important because it shows part of this massive planned city, which was developed based on 1940s, 50s green city planning and new town planning from the UK, and was held up at its time as a model exemplar of that type of thinking, because this was regarded as such a significant development when it started. I'm now going to hand over to Lochner, who's going to start going into the content.
Yeah, so we're just going to start off with thinking about 6 lessons, and Etienne will at the end try to pull this together again. But I think the first one is that what hasn't happened here, but that should happen, is a long-term intergovernmental support and program to support decline. So that has been probably one of the lessons that we couldn't see. The second thing is that I think we all need to think about very hard is how we plan these places originally and what the long-term implications are. So the Garden City ideas, these that were seen as very modern at the time, are actually the problems that we've seen. I have created problems in decline that we all need to think about very carefully. The third lesson, I think, is that we all need to think about migration and mobility in terms of decline and what it means. So how we think about mobility to these places, and often the thinking is only on the upfront and not at the back end to think about mobility. So we'll also show that inappropriate mine closure holds long-term socioeconomic and environmental risks. More should be done to understand the geographical realities of these mining areas, declining mining areas, and we'll show how what the levels of dependency or dependencies have been on commodity prices, and link back to issues of path dependency and lock-ins. So just to sort of do a brief historical overview of the development. So it starts off in 1933 with some exploration. The interesting thing is that the person that did the exploration ended up 100 feet away from the gold when explored in 1933, and didn't have money to continue. So these goldfields are about 300 kilometers, 200 kilometers away from the first goldfields in South Africa, and the same geological patterns on the outskirts were also present here, and they made some deductions, but ended up in 1933. And of course, with the Great Depression, there was no money to really take this forward. So the first sort of large-scale deposits are found then in 39-40, but of course, because of the war, there's no development. The Second World War takes place, and then in 1946, the mining companies involved start to think about actually mining this. And one of the things they ask is a request for the establishment of new towns. So this was in a period where you couldn't just establish these new towns. There was no legislation in the specific province to deal with establishing new towns, and they actually had to use legislation from another province to try and create these new towns. A very specific decision is taken not to create one big place, but to create a number of smaller places. Welkom, that Etienne has referred to as being the main place, but there's a very specific decision, according to this legislation, also to create smaller places around this. So in 47, Anglo American then consolidates a number of smaller companies, which then also makes it possible to start large-scale mining at the point, and they've been the dominant miner up till the early 90s. There were a few others as well, but they were the dominant people. Then Welkom is proclaimed as a township or first managed by the company. In those initial years, they appointed Mr. Backhouse, British town planner, in 1948 to do the town planning, and that's where the Garden City ideas. And this is not specific to the Free State Goldfields. It's also been very prominent in the copper belt in Zambia at that point, to bring in someone from outside with Garden City planning ideas. There's a first election of a board in 53. In 57, they received full municipal status, and Anglo doesn't manage the town anymore. Very interesting is that as early as 1960, a committee is appointed by the provincial government to investigate the economic diversification of the area. And there's an early concern as far back as 1960 that gold won't hold, and that we need to make plans. Of course, when you read these plans, you get a sense of how silly people were in the process, but at the same time, it is not the worst plans that they've created at that point. So it's a very time, or they're limited by the time in terms of what they dish up at that point. However, then the big red flag in 1972, as the US leaves the gold standard, and the one implication is that the price of gold goes skyrocket fairly quickly. What it means is that mines that were marginal by 1972 suddenly aren't marginal anymore. It also means that these plans that were created in the 60s are shelved. And the consequence is that a new boom, just people have forgotten the fact that it could actually run out of gold at some point in the process. That jumps us to about 1987, and it's the first signs of the gold price dropping, and it's at the height of production, and the first signs then globally that the gold price now drops. At that point, and again, people see this coming, and the one thing they do is to start to plan, to think, what does this mean for the city, and they develop a new structure plan at that point. And then the first large retrenchments from mines happened in 1991, and then throughout since 1995, various attempts for economic diversification in the area. So I've spoken about the US leaving the gold standard, and there you can just see what happens in 71. The gold price just goes up, starts going up, and by 1980 it is substantially above $600 per fine ounce, and that's the thing that creates a huge boom from the 70s and sort of blinds everybody at that point for what's going on. So on this slide you can see how the shafts and the number of mining companies involved in the area. So you've got, by 1993, you had about 44 shafts in the area, and that drops down since 1993. So a massive scale of mining production over time. The population change. So the huge population increase from the 1950s, where there was virtually nothing, till about nearly 500,000 people in 1991, and then a drop down in population over time. But it's not as if everybody moves out. There is a decline in population, but not a wipeout of population because of mine closure. This slide gives you a picture of the number of mine workers in the area. Now, what you need to understand is that when they planned the goldfields in the 50s, the technology changed since what has happened in the Witwatersrand, already estimates that they would only use about a third of the labor needed in the first goldfields in the Witwatersrand. So what you have here is about 180,000 mine workers by 1980, and that would have been, if you had the equivalent, the same technology back in the 1800s, early 1900s, that would have meant about 500,000 mine workers. But it's only 180,000, and you can see how that falls from about 180,000 in 1988 to around 20,000 at the current moment. So you lose about 90% of your mine workers in the process over that period. So a couple of notes about the planning. I've referred to the fact that except for one town called Oordenalsrus and maybe Ventersburg as well in the area, there's no existing urban area in 1950. There's no legislation to facilitate this, and they use some legislation from a previous dispensation to make this work, and they copy this into the province to make this work. So the main thing about this piece of legislation was that it's a decision to establish medium-sized towns and not one big place, and that's why you've got these different mining places, and three of them, Welkom, Virginia, and Allen Ridge, were planned by outside planners. Welkom specifically, well, Mr. Backhouse, but Virginia and Allen Ridge, different planners, largely from the UK at that point. So this is a quote from a document written by Mr. Backhouse, the planner, and you sort of need to think about see a couple of highlights there. The one is it's framed as modern. It's framed as the first for Africa, framed as in Garden City terminology as with neighborhood units, green wedges, the aisles very wide, lots of dependence on vehicles, very specific planning for commercial areas, lots of emphasis on parking lanes, and it's framed as convenient, pleasant, modern at that point, which of course the question then is what are the implications, and you can see some of the planning below of these wide streets, etc. The issue is that, and Etienne will come back to that a little bit later, is that many of these places struggle, or the place struggles to maintain this infrastructure. It's a maintenance issue. It's providing water and sanitation in decline. And if this infrastructure could have been 20 or 30% less, it would have made a bit of a difference in decline. On the housing side, it is that the black workforce was housed in compounds or hostels, single-sex hostels, and you see some examples of that down there. A long history of these compounds in diamonds, where control was the main mechanism, but some of those ideas taken over to gold as well. And from the 180,000 workers, probably 120 to 140,000 were living in compounds at some point in the area. The white mine workers were largely housed in this open town, but in housing owned by the various mining companies. So initially, about nearly 60% of houses in Welkom were houses housed or owned by mining companies. Now, the one implication here is that if the mine houses own this a large number, they've paid the rates and taxes very diligently to the municipality, and when decline happens, there's no institutional memory to actually deal with collecting rates and taxes, because 60% of these were paid upfront by the mining companies. This started to, so both the hostels and the thing started to change in the mid-80s, and in the early 1990s, there's a system of living out allowances. So the irony is that white mine workers who live didn't live near the mine, had a living out allowance, and in the transformation of the early 90s, that becomes not acceptable. And it moves to a system where any worker now can get a living allowance if they don't live near the mine. The consequence of this is that if you close high density housing compounds in the early 90s and you provide living out allowances, one of the consequences is that you find lots of informal settlements and urban sprawl in a place where there's actually decline and where you can't actually afford many of those issues. Just to illustrate this to you, so that's on the left-hand side, you see a little bit of some of these ex-mining sites and how they look today and the decline in the town. But on the right-hand side, the picture shows you settlement in 1990 and settlement in 2014. So what you need to understand is you see massive decline economically, but you see land, urban land being expanded in the red in 2014. And this is the result of this living out allowances, compounds closure, and you need to deal. So the problem gets shifted from an inhumane compound system to the municipality to manage at that point. So we've done some work on understanding housing prices over time. So these are real figures. So inflation being taken into account, and the line, the black line, is the total. The moral of the story is if you did own a house in 1988, you would have not seen it grow in real terms. It would have been still the value of 1988 over time. So many people, if you were sort of middle class and you stayed on, you would not be able to sell this in any way and make some profit on the asset that you would have had over time. This just shows you, so the house prices compared to CPI, and the black line on top is the CPI over since 1988, and you can see that property prices haven't kept up in this regard. This just shows you both on the property prices in real, it shows the property taxes of the municipality in real values on the second and third columns. And you can see that it's very difficult to keep up. The whole system comes under pressure over time, and it's very, very difficult to have a municipal system in an open town to create income. And the same applies to service charges. Although service charges, you would see that there is some increase, and it's largely got to do with the increase in price of electricity, which most municipalities can't. They need to just give it over to customers. They can't manage it in any specific way. It also means that the municipality owes 10 billion rand to Rand Water, and that's in South African terms, this is a very large amount. It's also a large amount owed to Rand Water and to Eskom. That's the bulk service providers in the area.
Can you take over? Yes, now I'll take over at this point. So what we see is this story of a boom in gold and the outcome of gold losing its shine, quite literally, and its implications on people and the local authority, but it extends into housing, services, retail, etc. And one of the challenges is we see that as formal jobs are lost, it doesn't necessarily translate into large numbers of people leaving the area, but often it means increased destitution. It means that certainly for many of the lower skilled workers, many of them stay on in Welkom, but start finding jobs in what's called the informal sector. In other words, self-employment, welding, backyard manufacturing, some illegal activities, etc. Property values, as Lochner has said, are affected. Rates income goes down, but over time we start to see service charges increase because the population has plateaued as opposed to shrunk. So the council is faced with this dilemma of providing required life services, water, sewage, maintaining electricity, etc. But it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. And this is an article from last month, shown on the left-hand side. One city that owes more money than it makes. This, unfortunately, the local municipality in Welkom is the only municipality in the country whose debt exceeds its income. And that's by a figure of 137%. On top of that, not only is the costs much higher than the income, but in recent years, there've been other allegations of delivery problems, corruption allegations, etc. And all of these significantly complicate what's playing out on the ground. And it illustrates the challenge of, well, I do put the word falling population, but marginally so. But nonetheless, the reality that you've got all these people and you have to still maintain services. And being a garden city is problematic because that means sprawl. It means extensive infrastructure networks which have to be maintained. And then, as Lochner said, many of the new housing areas are even further out. So that all becomes a major challenge in terms of issues to cover. The other points I've more or less dealt with. If we look at the employment profile, this is a rather sobering reality. As you can see there, we're looking at employment by sector. Line near the top takes us across in years from 1980 to 2010. We don't have more up-to-date figures than that. The bottom line on the table shows us the total number of formal sector jobs, and you can see it peaks at 275,000 in 1987, but by 2010 it's down to 84,000. So a very significant drop there. If you go to the top of the table, the first three lines, agriculture, more or less constant, some fluctuations up and down, but mining is obviously 184,000 in 87 down to 35. Mining in the area sees a drop from 10,000 to 2,000. So really quite a disastrous impact on the formal employment sector. Now, in terms of local response, Lochner's already mentioned the steering committee, the various structure plans, etc. Now, just to take that slightly forward, what we have here from the 1960s to the 2020s, we see the various largely locally led efforts to respond to both the perceived impending crisis and then the actual one which played out. So the steering committee, as Lochner mentioned, looked at diversification, it looked at irrigation, but largely its work totally logical. It lost a lot of its steam because of the boom in the gold price. But the next column, the Welkom structure plan, it was realized there were going to be problems. They start planning at this stage for an assumed diversification for housing focused. Now that never really came about. So certainly the housing expanded. It certainly never reached 1 million people, and a lot of the housing was unplanned and informal. A very key intervention from the 1990s was the establishment of a purpose-designed centre to respond to the scenario, and they started with a whole range of catalytic projects, things like creating the national freight airport. Further down the column, the word Pakisa refers to a rather unusual plan which actually saw fruition to create an international motor. I held a couple of international events, but it only lasted about 2 or 3 years and just became a white elephant. Slightly more successful was then establishment of a jewelry school, but this was a drop in the ocean compared to what needed to be undertaken. We then go, after that period, the development center for various political reasons is closed, and we see various other agencies come about, as shown in the next 3 columns. The new LED plan is local economic development plan. It's very difficult. There's been and we certainly pick up on no major development. So we see the town limping along with plans, but they don't really reach fruition. Now, one of the things, obviously, when we see mine closure is the need to encourage diversification. And it was only from the 2010s that we started to pick up anything significant in this regard. But I do need to point out that there's no ways this is reaching or addressing the scale of job loss which played out. And a lot of the obvious shortfall translates into unemployment, a limited degree of out-migration, but given South Africa's high unemployment rates, there's not really that many places unemployed people can go to. But some of the diversification we see, picture at the top middle, a major regional shopping center goes into, because there is a market, even if it's a low-income market, there is an expansion in regional healthcare facilities with all the people there. Picture right in the middle of the slide, a picture at the top right show some of the facilities which are there, and I think the middle one's the state hospital facility. There has been some expansion in government services. Employment hasn't been restored, but one of the key people rely on is informal sector activity. So picture right at the bottom, possibly a former miner selling things on the pavement to passers-by. And one of the things which also takes place is illegal mining, which you've probably heard about, of people breaking into old mine shafts or old mine dumps, often scaling down in the shafts thousands of meters to retrieve gold ore, bringing it to the surface and having illegal micro refining facilities. I mean, this is not dramatic in terms of its scale, but it reflects in times of desperation how people respond and how they survive. Now, just in terms of just a slight aside as to how dramatic the shock was, in 1988, 1990, this table was developed of the possible scenarios of what could go wrong if the gold price fell precipitously. And in 1990, scenario 2 was deemed to be the most likely. They saw the price of gold going down to $400 a ton, mining production halving, and it caught a 25% loss in mine employment. That's what they anticipated would roll out in the 1990s. They were caught totally off guard because scenario 4 came about 2 years later. And that led to a drop to only 20% of production, a 50% reduction in mine employment, and very new industrial diversification. So it was being caught off guard and not really being in a position to respond. Garden city extensive urban planning didn't help. But it's not just in terms of those risks of jobs, etc. It's dealing with the legacy of mining, managing the tailings dams, the mine dumps. This is something which happened long as the closure started, and Lochner's done a lot of work on it, but it was the major failure of a tailings dam. Pictured on the left-hand side, picture of the right, you can see the spoil as it flooded into the neighboring town of Virginia. So this is part of the risk of the environmental legacy which is left. Parallel risks, the tailings, radiation from the extractive processes, the sterile physical environment, acid mine drainage, the lack of closure, and this micro mining and crime, anchored on crime, unfortunately, taking place. And these are all the things which go with the inevitability of closure. But when you're resource poor and maybe the regulations aren't affected as they should be, these things are going to persist for decades. So then, just to close off, some final reflections for the study. So what we see is the modern planning from the 50s became a problem in the present. Low densities, expansive infrastructure, and now a weak economic base to sustain it. This has implications for how you manage and how you plan it, and particularly if your rates income is down and you're not receiving that much government support, you've got a major problem. One of the other problems is there were these scenarios, there was long-term planning, but the long-term thinking was out of step with how fast reality moved. So the argument here is to be rather incremental and flexible because the scenario just outstripped what was anticipated. This is quite ironic, closure leading to the expansion of urban settlement, simply because, as Lochner said, people didn't leave, or very few people left, sorry to correct myself, but also people moved out of the formal mine housing into now more expanding, often informal housing areas. Questions of intergovernmental relations, is there enough support probably the answer self-evidence. Classic case, unfortunately, of the terms path dependency and lock-in. A city booms on wealth, but often, despite some goodwill, it never fully diversifies. And it certainly shows the need to plan for closure and build resilience right from the start of operations. Last two slides, some more reflections. Clearly, we see there were problems with local agency, local being sometimes inappropriate, like building the Formula One motorbike racing circuit out of step with employment needs and the reality of the area. Certainly, as Lochner spoke about, that rethinking of home ownership has played out here, is critical in terms of, are we talking about ownership? Are we talking about housing removal? What do you sell property as? What happens to people who own property, which loses its value? Also need to think more creatively about infrastructure to maybe make it more flexible in terms of its long-term use. There's reflections on the danger of depending on prices, giving a false sense of security. Quite clearly, what this area and its environmental devastation shows is a failure to integrate environmental, social, and economic considerations. The other thing which certainly has come, disruption of closure and significant criminal impact it's had. And then just the last slide, the salutary comment to carefully think about declining, but also to right-size infrastructure to changing population, either in number or where populations are living. It also shows the geographical realities and used the term peripheral mine areas. It's kind of periphery despite having 500,000 people, but peripheral in the sense of it's not part of the economic mainstream of the country, and it became a mono-economy, leading to path dependence and this now extremely difficult challenge of how do you break that dependence. Fourth point, yes, there's slow signs, particularly as town wealth goes down. And it's just the other thing is just the sheer magnitude of the problem. It wasn't dealing with one small mine and one small mining town. You're dealing with a very significant proportion of the national population living in the area and were directly affected by what played out. And certainly it would be very difficult to say appropriate steps were put in place. I'm going to stop it there and hand back to Tom at this point.
Thanks, Etienne. Thanks, Lochner. And thank you for your presentation. We did have a few audio problems a couple of times. You sort of just, kind of cut in and out a couple of times, but I heard you. And maybe just try to keep a similar distance to the microphone might help as well. But
Sure.
There was just welcome questions in the chat, but a couple of things come to my mind just while we wait for any more questions there. Look, it's quite interesting, and one of the things that makes me remember is some of the work I've done myself, actually, and colleagues have done with regards to coal and also to gas in certain regions where you get a boom, the effects can be very sudden, but when you get the bust, the effects can be very slow. So there is this sort of retention issue which can happen. I think it's often, as you were saying, there's a changeover in population, and I think it's also a matter, as you were sort of saying, that there's not necessarily somewhere else to go, or people kind of have embedded in their lives. So you might have someone working in the mine, but you might have someone else, the kids in the school, and the partner working in the shop, and or whatever it might be. So I think there's this sort of lag effect, and we've also seen that with both the coal sector and the gas sector as well. So no, I think it's very, very interesting, but perhaps this is a particularly strong case of that. From your perspective, this sort of lingering, let's just call it sort of stagnating effect, is it restricted to this area, or have you seen that elsewhere in South Africa?
Yeah, I think there are examples. I mean, there are examples of both, I suppose. I think there are, if I think about iron ore, you can see the same type of situation there. It probably depends on where it is and what the existing migration patterns are. So it's just harder for lower income people if to move in and out despite having existing migration. So Tom, it varies largely between place and place, but I think it's not uncommon elsewhere. That's just long and the short of the story.
Yeah, I think if I could come there, like Australia, South Africa has had literally thousands of mines over the decades. Often, when many of the smaller mines closed down 100+ years ago,
Maybe just repeat that, Etienne. We're losing you with the sound there.
in the country meant that often. Okay. Okay, I'm just coming a bit closer. I'll just start again. And what I was basically saying is, like Australia, South Africa's had thousands of mines over the decades, and many of the small ones have come and gone. Decades ago, often the mine workers were able to move to another mining area simply because of the scale which existed, partially assisted by the very discriminatory and racist labor system, which often meant prior to the 1990s that black mine workers weren't permanent urban residents. They were often living in hostels, and it was often without their families. And it was hence easier to relocate to somewhere else where while mining was booming. But what's now happened was with the ending of apartheid, populations became more settled, became more permanent in urban areas, and it became more difficult to move, particularly when housing purchasing started, overlapping also with the demise of gold mining in other parts of the country, as well as coal mining in other parts of the country. So whereas the situation was more fluid prior to 1990, post 1990, a different game is playing out. Mine workers are buying houses. The property market collapses and they can't actually move often. And as you say, or some people are buying houses, others are building their own. And as you say, families are there, they have other jobs, kids are in schools. So you witness a static population often and a lowering often of the quality of life in the area.
Thanks, both of you. Look, I have to say it's kind of an interesting discussion. We're talking about this in the context of decline in the gold mining situation, and we're talking. You presented the slides with the decline in the gold price, and yet, if we think about the current day, we have a surging gold price over $4,000 US an ounce. So there's a slightly strange, if you like, mismatch there between what we're presenting from the past and what we're seeing today, at least around the world. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in this region in the current day? Has it been reflected in renewed mining or in a kind of reopening of any of these mines?
I think the issue is so first of all, the mining in this area is extremely deep. So it's been it's huge underground mining. So the cost of underground mining is a big issue. The fact that the gold price is that high has meant that 20,000 jobs have been maintained for the last 10 years and probably will continue to some degree. So the current high gold price extends the existing life of gold mining in South Africa. If it wasn't for that, it would have been out 10, 15, 20 years ago. The other thing that goes with that the high gold price is the artisanal illegal mining and people going down illegally old shafts. And that is kept, and to some degree that keeps the economy of the place going as well, is the illegal economy, or whatever you want to call it. So in that sense, that keeps going to a large degree.
Yeah, and I think just a couple of extra points. One, just to reiterate how deep this mining is. Much of this, when it was booming, was well over 3,000 meters down. So the operational cost was extremely high. Certainly, the deeper they were going, much thinner seams of gold, so far more costly to extract relative to all output. But also your big role players, Anglo-American disinvest from this area, and it's far easier, presumably, to now extract gold from Mali or Tanzania, where mining isn't, or to move into. I think the one thing we didn't point out is the degree to which big mining giants hand over production to much smaller, often locally owned operatives who simply don't have the capital base to operate at the scale which would be required to reopen closed shafts.
Okay. Look, we do have a question here from Susan O'Byrne, which is, how are the mining companies evolving their approach to closure planning and implementation? So how are the mining companies evolving their approach to closure and implementation?
I think with this one, what we picked up probably 20 years ago is many of the big mines were quite actively involved in looking at efforts at diversification and working with local municipalities. But often what has happened is the ownership of mines has gone from a large operator to often smaller operators. So many of the shafts are still technically owned. And the smaller operators, it would be very difficult to see them as deeply engaging with community and local council. Maybe more at a micro level with the individual mining staff or localized communities around an area, but it's been a politically fraught process. That would be in terms of conflict between local authorities and mining companies with different expectations as to what should be done. Probably in the early 1990s, there was a more harmonious relationship between council when this very large Free State Development Corporation was established. It was supported by the big mining groups, but for various reasons that saw its demise, and it would be a far more haphazard form of engagement now, sadly to say.
Just on that, and I can see there's still some questions coming in, which is great, but on the infrastructure, I was interested if you can clarify the ownership model for the infrastructure. So you did touch on the sort of the utilities and the infrastructure and the services being expensive. And what we see in some places is if these were initially developed by a mining company and then transferred to the state, sometimes there can be an issue with the state or local authority not having the resources to operate these effectively. So has this ownership issue been relevant for the infrastructure in this location?
So maybe I was just explain how it works, and then I will try to answer the question. So effectively, bulk infrastructure, electricity and water are being provided by different units outside of the scope of the municipality. So they buy bulk from the South African electricity utility called Eskom, and they buy bulk water from Rand Water, which is a water board. So the issue is not. I mean, there are issues in bulk, but of course, when it goes into the municipality, they need to manage the infrastructure, and they add to the cost. So they add 10 or 20% and sell this off. And this has been very long. So the mines never managed that. I'm not sure what the situation before 1957 was, but in the last 50, 60 years, that was never a big issue. Of course, what I've explained earlier is a bit of a more of a problem, and that was this transition from mine-owned housing to individually owned housing. Part of the problem is that the municipality still doesn't have a list of who owns what and where to send accounts to. And it comes from the fact that 60% of accounts were paid in the 90s by one or two mining companies at that point. So it's the memory that I think is largely the problem, and not so much in the management of these services.
Right. Yeah, that is definitely really interesting example of housing. And I guess there's many contexts where you have this mixture of housing ownership, which might be company provided, might be state provided, might be private sector for rental and so on. But look, it looks like we have one last question before we wrap it up. It's from Louisa Nicholson. My apologies if this has already been discussed. Thank you for an interesting presentation. I would be interested to hear your opinions as to which group should have been proactively seeking to diversify the local economy in this example, and how they could have been motivated earlier to plan for the future. Should there be more conscious effort by local communities and governments to gain control of how their economy will grow post-mining? So there's a question there about roles.
Oh, interesting. Great question, Louisa. I mean, yes, very definitely. That work in the 1960s should really have been followed on with. People were beguiled by the rising price of gold when the US left the gold standard, and they should well, obviously there was a logic to mine more gold. There should have been strenuous efforts to diversify. Certainly, Lochner and I became quite involved with that group known as the Free State Goldfields Development Association, and they strenuously spent millions looking at different diversification options, from agriculture to manufacturing, etc., etc. I mean, sadly, there is the reality that this is quite a semi-arid environment. There's no ways it's high productive agriculture. The industrial base which was established was totally anchored on the mining industry. And you have to think of a place, towns 70 years ago. There weren't 500,000 people, so you did not have a strong economic base to diversify into. At other levels, I mean, obviously one would like to say that there's opportunities which can be pursued, etc., etc. But you do hear various structural challenges. One is environmental. Number three is the negative perception of the area to potential investors, because it's seen as a very economically depressed area. Number four, 300 kilometers away from Johannesburg, so investors are probably far more likely to invest there. And unfortunately, also academic theory of path dependency and social lock-in, where often after generations, the local focus is often so geared around mining that it's been difficult for people to often envisage an alternate future. And even if at the level of unemployed people seeking self-employment, their diversification is ultimately linked to mining and mining skills, either illegal mining or using skills acquired in the mining, such as welding, etc., to provide a service role in their local communities. But there's no large-scale alternative economic option which has been actively pursued for nearly 25 years now, unfortunately. Sorry if that sounds a bit bleak, but it is a reflection on the unfortunate failure to plan early on, the unfortunate failure to network with all stakeholders, and the politicization of the process, as well as resource constraints. Sorry, is that too negative, Lochner? He's nodding. We've lost you, Tom.
Muted.
You're muted, Tom.
I'd like to thank you. We have to wrap it up there because we're right on time. So thank you, Lochner. Thank you, Etienne, and thank you to everyone for joining us for today's webinar.